Every time a bag of rice entered our home, I knew it was my turn to pay the price. I was just a child, yet I already understood that food was never free in my house. Other children waited for their mothers to call them for dinner with joy. I waited with dread, because every grain of rice meant I had been traded like an object. Hunger was supposed to be the worst pain a child could endure, but for me, hunger was only the beginning. The real pain came after the plates were filled. The sound of plastic bags crinkling still haunts me. Most families hear that sound and think of comfort, of groceries, of meals waiting to be cooked. For me, it was the sound of betrayal. It meant my mother had made another deal. I can still see her hands clutching the bags as if they were treasures, ignoring the way I froze, ignoring the fear in my eyes. She would place the food carefully on the kitchen counter, rice, beans, sometimes canned goods, and behind her stood the man who had provided it. He was not family. He was not a friend. He was just someone who knew how desperate we were and how much my mother was willing to sacrifice to fill a pot. Most people cannot imagine what it means to grow up with an enemy inside your own home. I did not have the luxury of believing that adults would protect me. My mother, the woman who gave me life, offered me in silence. Her lips never spoke the words, but her eyes told the truth. She wanted the food more than she wanted my safety. And the cruelest part was that she never looked guilty. She looked relieved. Relieved that the hunger would quiet down for one more night, even if it meant selling her own daughter's body and soul. Children are not supposed to understand the language of survival so young, but I did. I knew the weight of a half-empty stomach, the ache of trying to sleep while my insides burned with hunger. I knew the humiliation of waiting for charity that never came. But worse than all of that, I knew what it meant to be the payment, to be the thing exchanged so my mother could avoid shame, so she could serve a plate of rice without admitting we had nothing. She thought the neighbors would respect her if we had food on the table. She thought no one would ask questions if the smell of beans filled the house. But the truth was, the smell of food always came with the stench of violence. I was small, but my senses were sharp. I can remember the way the kitchen floor felt cold against my bare feet as I waited. I can remember the way the man's footsteps echoed in my chest like a hammer striking over and over. And I can remember my mother's silence. Silence louder than any scream. She did not protect me. She did not comfort me. She simply turned her back and counted the cans, as if that would make her less of a participant. There are people who believe that hunger makes a person stronger, that it teaches resilience. But what hunger taught me was that people will sacrifice anything when they are desperate, even their own children. My mother used to tell me when I was very little that food was sacred. She said never waste a grain of rice, never throw away bread. Years later, I understood that to her, food was sacred in a way that I was not. Food deserved to be saved. I did not. Even now, decades later, when I walk through a grocery store, I cannot help but feel my chest tighten. I see parents filling carts with cereal and milk, and I wonder if they know how lucky they are to pay with money instead of flesh. I wonder if they realize how beautiful it is that their children never have to question what the price of dinner might be. Sometimes I think back to the very first time it happened. I remember the hunger that had stretched on for days, the way my stomach had twisted into painful knots. My mother whispered that everything would be fine soon. She said someone was coming to help us. I believed her, because children always believe. When the man arrived, I thought he was bringing kindness. I thought maybe he was a hero, but the way his eyes slid toward me, the way my mother avoided my gaze, told me the truth before I could even understand the words. I was the price. That night, I learned that food can taste like ashes, even when you are starving. I ate the rice with tears running down my face, every bite heavy with shame. My mother praised the man for his generosity. She smiled at him, and for a moment I thought maybe she loved him more than she loved me. I sat at the table, chewing slowly, trying not to choke, and realized that every mouthful was poisoned, not by the food itself, but by the knowledge of what it had cost. The body can forget hunger. With time, the ache in your stomach fades, but the soul never forgets betrayal. And betrayal was the first real flavor of my childhood. It was sharper than hunger. heavier than emptiness. It became the air I breathed, the ground I walked on, the shadow that followed me into every room. I used to ask myself if maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe other children went through the same thing and simply did not speak about it. But deep down, I knew the truth. What was happening inside my home was not survival. It was cruelty dressed as necessity. It was hunger being used as a weapon. It was my mother choosing food over me, over and over again. And so, every time a bag of rice came through that door, my chest grew tighter. Every time I smelled beans cooking on the stove, I felt my innocence slipping away. Each crinkle of a plastic bag became the drumbeat of my fear. And with each passing day, I realized I was not being raised like other children. I was being consumed, traded, sacrificed, all in the name of survival that never truly saved us. My name is Luciana Mendes da Silva. Today I am 68 years old, and I live in a small town tucked away in the countryside of Alabama. People know me here for the fresh bread and pies I sell at the community fair every Saturday morning. They see an older woman with silver hair tied back neatly, always offering a smile, always ready to hand a child a free cookie. To them, I'm just a kind vendor who has spent decades baking for others. What they do not see is the life I had to survive to stand behind that booth. They do not see the scars that are carefully hidden beneath long sleeves, or the memories that no oven can burn away. When I arrange the jars of jam on my wooden table at the fair, I sometimes imagine what the customers think. Perhaps they believe I had a sweet childhood filled with recipes passed down by loving hands. They assume the smell of fresh bread comes from tradition, not survival. The truth is that the first time I ever learned how to cook, it was not because my mother wanted to teach me. It was because she needed me to stretch the little food we had. I was 8 years old, standing on a wooden stool, trying to stir beans that were too few to feed us all. My mother's voice was sharp behind me, telling me not to waste even a grain. I remember staring into that pot and realizing that in our house, food was more precious than love. People often say small towns are safe places where everyone knows each other. In many ways, that was true. Our neighbors greeted us with polite smiles. They commented on how disciplined I was, how quiet and respectful. They saw my mother as a hardworking woman who was just struggling to make ends meet. They never saw what happened behind closed doors. The town praised her for being a survivor, but I was the real sacrifice hidden behind her survival. At church on Sundays, my mother wore her best dress. She held her head high, carrying her Bible as if it were a shield that could cover her sins. People called her strong. They admired her ability to keep going despite poverty. I sat beside her on the wooden pew, my stomach still aching from the night before, my body trembling under my simple cotton dress. The hymns echoed through the church, but instead of bringing peace, they reminded me of the silence in my own home. Every note felt like a lie we were forced to sing. Now, decades later, when I pass by the church in my town, I cannot help but remember that double life. The difference is that today, I am not afraid of being seen. I am not afraid of speaking the truth. Selling bread at the fair may seem small to some, but to me, it is a symbol of freedom. Each loaf I sell carries the proof that I no longer have to trade my dignity for food. Each smile I give is real, not a mask to hide my suffering. I sometimes wonder how I managed to keep surviving when I was a child. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the belief that one day I would grow old and tell my story without fear. I think about that little girl sitting in a wooden chair, too small for her feet to touch the ground, eating rice that had been bought with her pain. She had no idea that one day she would stand behind a table full of bread and pies, feeding others without having to lose herself in the process. Even now, when children run to my booths with coins in their hands, my heart tightens. I see their innocence, the way they smile without shame, the way they tug on their mother's sleeve to ask for another cookie. I think of what it means to grow up without carrying secrets too heavy for small shoulders. I give them extra treats, not because they need the sugar, but because I need to remind myself that childhood can be safe. Every person in this town knows me as the bread lady. They do not know that behind every loaf there is a history of hunger and pain. They do not know that I bake at dawn, not just because I enjoy it, but because it is in those quiet hours that I feel most at peace. The kitchen, once a place of fear where I was forced to cook meals that came at the highest cost, has now become the place where I reclaim my power. The same hands that once trembled in fear now knead dough with strength. When I look at my reflection in the bakery window of the fair, I see a woman who carries years of silence, yet also carries resilience. I see someone who was not supposed to survive, someone who was supposed to be broken forever. And yet, here I stand, offering warmth to others through food, the very thing that once destroyed me. It is a strange twist of fate that what once symbolized my suffering is now the tool of my healing. But there is something more hidden beneath that smile I give to strangers. Each time I share my bread, I think back to the girl I was, the one who never had enough to eat unless she paid the price with her body, the girl who sat at the table with food on her plate but tears in her eyes. I remind myself that she is still inside me, and that my duty now is to honor her by never staying silent again. And so, while the people in my town see only an elderly woman with kind eyes, I know the truth. I know the long road that brought me here. I know that behind every warm loaf lies a past cold as stone. My name is Luciana Mendes da Silva, and the woman you see smiling today is the same little girl who once lived in constant fear, waiting for the next bag of rice to arrive, knowing the price that would come with it. Hunger was not an occasional visitor in my childhood. It was a permanent resident, sitting with us at the table, even when there was nothing to serve. I can still remember the sound of my stomach growling at night, so loud in the silence that I feared the neighbors might hear it through the thin walls. Hunger is different when you are a child. It is not just a physical ache. It becomes a shadow that follows you everywhere, whispering reminders that you do not belong in the world of children who play freely and eat without worry. Our kitchen shelves were often bare. I used to open them hoping that maybe food had appeared overnight, like a miracle, but all I found was dust and emptiness. Sometimes there was a half-empty jar of flour or a small handful of beans that rattled in the pot like pebbles. My mother tried to stretch meals in ways that looked almost magical to me back then. She would add more water to soups until they were thin enough for us to drink instead of eat. She would cut bread into slices so thin you could almost see through them. She pretended it was enough, but I could see in her eyes that she knew it was not. Children in the neighborhood talked about breakfast as if it was a normal part of life. They compared lunch boxes at school, trading sandwiches and cookies. I stayed quiet. My lunch was often just a piece of stale bread or nothing at all. I used to drink water to trick my stomach into thinking it was full. Teachers would ask if I was feeling sick because I looked pale and tired, but I always smiled and said I was fine. Hunger teaches you to lie early. It teaches you to pretend, to nod, to keep secrets. I still remember the first time my mother told me not to complain. She said hunger was part of life, that many people had it worse, and that I should be grateful for what little we had. Gratitude was supposed to replace food, but no matter how hard I tried, gratitude never filled my stomach. At night, I lay in bed, pressing my hands over my belly, hoping the pressure would quiet the emptiness. Sometimes it worked for a while. Sometimes I cried until I fell asleep. Hunger also changes the way you see the world around you. I began to notice things I should not have noticed as a child. I noticed the way the butcher's son always had a red face from eating meat every day. I noticed the way the baker's daughter smelled like sugar and butter when she came to class. I noticed how other children threw away half-eaten apples while my mouth watered at the sight of the scraps. These things made me feel small, as if the world had been divided into those who deserved to eat and those who did not. There were moments when my mother tried to make it feel like a game. She would say, "Let us pretend this soup is rich and full of meat," or "Let us pretend this bread is cake." I played along because I wanted to believe. I wanted to close my eyes and taste what she described. But eventually, I learned that pretending only made the disappointment heavier when I opened my eyes again. The soup was still just cloudy water, the bread was still stale and dry, and the hunger was still there, waiting. Looking back, I realized that hunger did more than weaken my body. It prepared the ground for everything else that came. Hunger makes a person desperate. It strips away choices. My mother saw food as salvation, and because of that, she saw me as currency. The emptier the shelves became, the easier it was for her to justify what she was willing to do. A bag of rice was never just rice in our house. It was a bargain, a trade, a silent contract. And I, without understanding it fully, was part of that contract. What makes hunger so cruel is not just the pain in the stomach. It is the way it eats at dignity. It is standing in a room where others eat and pretending you are not jealous. It is watching your own mother praise the food on the table while ignoring the cost. It is realizing far too young that you are less valuable than the meal being served. Hunger was not just about the absence of food. Hunger was about the absence of safety, the absence of care, the absence of love. That is why I can never forget the early signs. The empty cabinets, the long nights, the way my body trembled with weakness at school. They were warnings of what was coming. They were the cracks in the foundation that would one day split open and swallow the rest of my childhood whole. Hunger was the first betrayal, the first wound, and it paved the way for the deeper wounds that followed. The arrival of food in our home should have been a moment of relief, a sign that the hunger would finally loosen its grip on our stomachs. But for me, it became the sound of dread. Every time I saw a bag of rice or cans of beans placed carefully on the kitchen counter, I felt my body stiffen. I knew what had been exchanged to bring them there. Food was supposed to be a blessing, but in our house, it came wrapped in silence and shame. The man who brought the food always carried himself with a false generosity. He acted as if he were saving us, as if his hands were noble because they held bread and rice. I hated the way he smiled at my mother, the way she looked away and pretended not to notice where his eyes lingered when they turned to me. To him, the food was not charity. It was a ticket, a key that gave him access to something he should never have touched. I learned to read his footsteps, the rhythm of his boots on our wooden floor. Each step a warning that the time for payment had arrived. My mother never explained it to me, but she did not need to. Her silence was explanation enough. She would place the bags of food on the counter and then avoid my eyes. Sometimes she would whisper, "It is only for a little while," or "We need this to survive." She spoke as if she were convincing herself, not me. I was still young, but not too young to understand betrayal. The world teaches children quickly when the lessons are carved into their skin and soul. There are details that never leave you. The way the plastic bags crinkled when he set them down. The way the beans rattled like marbles inside their sacks. The way the kitchen light flickered above us, buzzing faintly, as if even the house itself wanted to turn away from what was happening. I remember pressing my back against the wall, wishing I could melt into it, wishing I could disappear. My mother stood by the stove, her hands fidgeting with a dishcloth, pretending to busy herself while I paid the price for the food she had begged for. It is strange how quickly a child learns to separate body from soul. I would close my eyes and imagine I was somewhere else, anywhere else. Sometimes I pictured myself running barefoot in a field, the tall grass brushing against my legs, the sun warming my face. Other times I imagined I had no body at all, that I was just a shadow slipping out of the room, untouchable, invisible. Those escapes were the only way I could endure the moments that stole pieces of me. The cruelty was not only in what was done, but in how normal it became. Each sack of rice was another night I had to endure. Each can of beans was a reminder that my suffering was measured, weighed, and exchanged. Hunger was no longer just the emptiness in my stomach. Hunger became the excuse for everything. I learned that my value in my mother's eyes was not as her daughter, but as the payment she could offer to keep herself from the humiliation of begging on the street. What made it worse was the way she looked at me afterward. Not with love, not even with pity, but with relief. Relief that she would not have to listen to me cry of hunger that night. Relief that she could cook a meal and place it on the table without shame. Relief that she had chosen food, even if it meant sacrificing me. That look carved a wound deeper than any bruise, a wound that whispered over and over again, "You are worth less than a bag of rice." Sometimes, after it was over, I would sit at the table and eat the food he had brought. My mouth chewed, but my throat burned. Every bite tasted of ash, no matter how much salt or spice my mother added. I would stare at the steam rising from the rice and wonder how something so warm could feel so cold inside me. I wondered if my mother noticed, if she saw how I forced myself to swallow, how I held back tears with every bite. Maybe she noticed, maybe she did not care. I often thought about other children in the neighborhood, sitting down to meals without fear, never questioning what had been traded to put food on their plates. I envied them not for the food itself, but for the safety that came with it. For them, dinner was just dinner. For me, it was the aftermath of violence, the taste of betrayal, the confirmation that my childhood had been stolen piece by piece. Years later, I realized that food had become more than survival for me. It was a weapon. It was used to keep me quiet, to keep me compliant, to keep me broken. It was dangled in front of me like a promise, and then poisoned with shame. That is why, even now, as an old woman, I cannot look at a bag of rice without remembering those nights. I cannot smell beans cooking without feeling my chest tighten. Food should have been comfort, but for me, it was the currency of pain. And every time I sat there, chewing slowly, my body aching and my soul drifting far away, I thought about the cruel bargain my mother had made. She believed she was saving us from hunger, but in truth, she was feeding it. Hunger had grown bigger than an empty stomach. It had swallowed love, safety, and trust. And in its place, it left me, a child trapped in silence, paying the price for every meal that entered our home. There were nights when I thought I could outsmart the silence of that house. Nights when I told myself that if I stayed quiet, if I pretended to be asleep, maybe they would leave me alone. I tried everything a child could think of. I buried myself under blankets and pressed my body against the cold wall. I held my breath so I would not make a sound. I even whispered prayers into the darkness, hoping that if God could not stop it, at least he could hide me. But nothing worked. Sooner or later, the knock at the door came. Sometimes it was not even a knock, just the sound of my mother's voice telling me it was time. I remember the first time I tried to run. I had been planning it in my head for days, maybe weeks. I had seen the back gate of the yard, rusty and barely held together. And I thought maybe if I pushed hard enough, I could squeeze through. I waited until the house was quiet, until I could hear the deep rhythm of my mother's breathing from her room. I tiptoed across the kitchen floor, each board creaking like it wanted to betray me. My heart raced so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. I reached the gate, hands trembling as I pushed, but the metal shrieked so loudly it pierced the night, and within seconds, the lights in the house flicked on. My mother's shadow appeared in the doorway, and the look in her eyes told me I had not found freedom. I had found another punishment. After that, I stopped trying for a while. But the hope of escape never left me. I began to look for small chances during the day. When I went to school, I thought about telling my teachers. Sometimes I rehearsed the words in my head. Please help me. Something terrible is happening. But when I opened my mouth, the fear stuck to my throat like glue. What if they did not believe me? What if they told my mother? The image of her face, tight with anger and shame, kept me silent. I convinced myself that silence was safer, even though it was killing me inside. There were days when hunger became my weapon. I thought if I refused to eat the food he brought, maybe it would send a message. Maybe my mother would realize that I was not willing to be traded anymore. I stayed in my room, curling up on the thin mattress, letting the hunger burn through me. I drank water until I felt sick. My body trembled from weakness, but at least I had chosen it. At least this pain was mine. But my small rebellion never lasted long. My mother would come, her eyes hard, her hand gripping my arm. She would drag me to the table and force me to eat, reminding me in her silence that food mattered more than I did. Sometimes I tried to speak to the neighbors in quiet hints. I would linger by the fence, hoping someone would notice the bruises I tried to hide. Once, An older woman asked me why I always looked so tired, my lips parted, ready to let the truth spill out. But then I saw my mother standing behind the window, watching me with that cold expression that promised punishment if I dared. I shook my head and said I was fine. The woman smiled softly and walked away, never realizing how close she had been to saving me. The cruelest betrayal was that my mother herself stopped me from leaving. Once I gathered the courage to beg her, I told her I could not endure it anymore, that I wanted to go anywhere else, even the streets. Her response still echoes inside me. She looked at me as if I were a burden and said, without hesitation, without shame, "If you leave, who will bring us food?" In that moment, I understood that I was not her daughter anymore. I was her bargain, her sacrifice, the only thing she was willing to trade to keep herself from hunger. Each failed attempt chipped away at my hope, but it also planted something else inside me, a small seed of anger. Anger that my cries were ignored, anger that my hunger was used against me, anger that I was never allowed to be a child. That anger began to grow quietly, hidden under the layers of fear, until it was strong enough to push me forward. And so the nights continued, the attempts and failures blending together like a cruel cycle. But every bruise, every tear, every unanswered prayer became part of a fire I carried within me, a fire that told me one day, somehow, I would find a way out. Because if I stayed, I knew that hunger would not be the only thing to consume me. It was already clear that sooner or later, the silence in that house would destroy me completely. It is strange how salvation can come from the smallest acts of courage. For me, it came from the sound of a knock at our door one late afternoon. I had cried so many nights in silence that I no longer believed anyone could hear me, but someone had. A neighbor who had grown tired of hearing my muffled sobs, of seeing my frail body dragging itself to school, finally decided to step closer. She knocked, and in that simple sound lived the beginning of my freedom. I remember the way my mother's face tightened when she opened the door and saw her standing there. She tried to smile, tried to hide the truth behind her usual mask of strength. But the neighbor's eyes went past her and landed on me. I was standing barefoot in the corner of the kitchen, my arms wrapped around my small body, eyes red from crying. It was the first time in years that an adult truly looked at me, not as a problem, not as a burden, not as currency, but as a child who needed help. The days that followed felt like a blur. There were visits from people I had never seen before, people with clipboards and stern expressions, who asked questions I had never dared to answer. I was terrified, unsure of what would happen if I spoke the truth. But then I remembered that this might be my only chance. For the first time, my silence could no longer protect me. It was my voice that had the power to save me. So I told them everything, every bag of rice, every whispered command, every night where my mother traded me for food. I was taken away with nothing but a small bag. Inside it were a few clothes, worn and thin, and a doll I had kept since I was little, its button eyes almost falling off. It was not much, but to me it felt like carrying an entire lifetime of survival. I left that house without looking back. My mother stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face expressionless. She did not reach out, did not beg me to stay, did not cry. Her silence was her final gift to me, proof that she had chosen her path and left me to walk mine alone. Stepping into the car that waited outside, I felt a kind of fear I had never known before. But beneath that fear was something else, something fragile yet powerful. Hope. The air outside smelled different, freer, as if the world itself was telling me I had a chance to start over. My stomach was still empty, but my heart carried a fullness it had never known, the fullness of possibility. I was placed in a safe home where the bed was soft and no doors were locked at night. The first meal I had there was simple: bread, butter, and warm milk. But I cried as I ate it, not because of hunger, but because it was the first meal in my life that did not carry the weight of shame. For the first time, food was just food. It was not poisoned by betrayal. It was not a transaction. It was nourishment freely given. And in that moment, I realized that survival could be more than just enduring. It could mean beginning again. As I grew older, the scars of my past followed me, but they no longer defined me. I learned that the strength to heal does not come from forgetting, but from remembering without being destroyed. I built a life out of those broken pieces, shaping them into something that finally belonged to me. I became a woman who could stand tall, not because I had never been knocked down, but because I had risen each time the world tried to bury me. Even now, decades later, when I bake bread or cook rice, the memories surface, but instead of breaking me, they remind me of how far I have come. I am no longer the little girl who waited in silence for the sound of plastic bags. I am the woman who tells her story so that no child ever feels alone in their suffering. My past is heavy, but my voice is stronger. To those who have listened to my story, thank you. Thank you for giving me the one thing I was denied for so many years, the chance to be heard. Pain loses some of its power when it is spoken out loud, and maybe, just maybe, by sharing what I lived through, I can help someone else find the courage to speak too. If you are watching this and carrying your own scars, know this: you are not alone. Your pain is real, but so is your strength. Do not let silence convince you that you are worthless. You matter. You always mattered. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to survive one more day. I survived hunger, betrayal, and silence. I survived being treated as less than food itself. And now I live not just to survive, but to remind others that healing is possible. Even in the darkest nights, there is a knock waiting, a light ready to break through. And when it comes, hold on to it, because that light can carry you out of the shadows. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Your presence gives meaning to every word I have spoken. If my journey touched your heart, I invite you to stay close, to walk with me into the next story of survival and hope. There is another video on your screen right now, another life that carries lessons of pain and resilience. Click and continue with us, because each story is not just about the past. It is about all of us finding the strength to heal together.